some of the scholars have said because the heart inclines towards the left, and so the purpose is that the heart is inclining towards the Kaaba, or towards that centrality of the divinity in the life of man. Now, the actual physical heart, which is beating in our breast, beats at about 100,000 times a day. It's pumping 2 gallons of blood per minute and over 100 gallons per hour. If you actually took 100 gallons of water and moved them physically with your body from one place to another, by the end of it you'd be quite exhausted. And yet this human heart is pumping 2 gallons of blood per minute, over 100 gallons per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, for an entire lifetime. The vascular system that it's sending this life-giving blood is over 60,000 miles long. In other words, more than 2 times the circumference of the earth. So the blood is actually being forced through the body over 60,000 miles of vascular system in the human body. Now, one of the interesting things also about the heart is that we know that it actually starts beating before the brain is formed, which means that the heart has its own beat. In other words, the heart itself begins to beat without any central nervous system. Now, the dominant theory is that the central nervous system is what's controlling the entire human being from the brain. And yet we know now that the nervous system does not initiate the beat of the heart, that it's actually self-initiated, and we also know, or we would say initiated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also we know now that the entire heart, all of the connections to the brain can be severed in a heart transplant, and another heart can be put into a human being's body, and the heart continues to beat without any connection to the brain whatsoever, because we cannot regenerate nerve cells. So the fact that the heart itself is not only the center of the human being, but it is not beating because of the brain, because of the central nervous system. Now, another interesting thing about the brain is that the human being, there are many actually people that think that the brain is also the center of consciousness. And yet the Quran very clearly states, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts that they're not able to think with, or they're not able to understand with. And so the understanding from that, according to the Muslims, is that the center of the intellect, the center of human consciousness, is the heart and not the brain itself. And it's only recently that human beings have realized that there are over 40,000 neurons in the heart. In other words, there are actually cells in the heart that are communicating, and there's understood to be a two-way communication between the brain and the heart. In other words, the brain sends the heart messages, but the heart is also sending the brain message. And these things are only recently being discovered. There was a study done by 2 physiologists in the 70s, John and Beatrice Lacey, that found that the brain actually sent messages to the heart, but the heart did not automatically obey the messages. Sometimes it speeded up, and other times it slowed down, indicating that the heart itself has its own type of intelligence. Now, the brain gets signals from the heart that reach the amygdala, the thalamus, and the cortex, which relates to emotions. The cortex, or the neocortex, relates to learning and reasoning. And these are only recently discovered, and we don't fully understand them. But what we do know is that the heart is an extremely sophisticated organ, and it's also, according to the hadith, it's a source of knowledge. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that wrong action is what irritates the heart, and you do not desire other people to see it. So the heart actually knows wrong action, and this is one of the reasons why people can do terrible things, but ultimately they're affected. If you look, for instance, in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, what the brilliant Russian author was indicating in that story was that the crime itself is the punishment, because human beings have to live with the results of their actions. And that the soul, when somebody does a crime, when somebody does something that is against the heart, is against the soul, then that actually affects the human being to the degree that they will go into a state of spiritual agitation, and they will use many, many ways to cover this up. This is what kufr is. It's a covering up. They will use alcohol, they will use drugs, they will use sexual experiment, they will use all seeking power, seeking wealth, seeking fame, all of these ways to try to basically to go into a state of heedlessness, into a state of submersion into the world that makes us forget our essential nature, that makes us forget our hearts. And so people become very cut off from their hearts. Now, one of the things about being cut off from the heart is that the more cut off from the heart you get, the sicker the heart gets, because the heart needs nourishment. And heedlessness is basically starving the spiritual heart. When you go into a state of unawareness, of lack of awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of your ultimate concern, which is the akhirah, the infinite world in relation to the finite world, that we're only in this world for a temporary period. And so that when you look at the infinite world in relation to the finite world, suddenly your concerns become focused on the infinite world and not on the finite world. And yet, when somebody is completely immersed in the finite world, believing that they will be here forever, believing that they will not be taken into account for their actions, that this action in and of itself ultimately leads to the spiritual death of the heart. But before it dies, and then becomes putrid and completely foul, it will show many symptoms. And these are called the diseases of the heart. These are the spiritual diseases of the heart. Now, these diseases are divided into two. There are two types of diseases. The first are called shubuhat. And these are diseases that relate to the understanding. So, for instance, if somebody is fearful of their provision from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they're afraid that they won't get their food for the day or their provision, this is a disease of the heart, because a sound heart has trust. A sound heart actually trusts in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a sick heart has doubt. So the sound heart trusts in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala absolutely. And this is why the heart does not worry. The heart, it's the nafs, it's the ego of the human being, it's shaitan, it's the caprice, the hawa, and dunya, the love of this ephemeral world, that all lead to this state of fear, of anxiety. The heart in and of itself is actually an organ designed to be in a state of stillness, but the stillness will only come about by the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنَّ الْقُلُوبِ. Isn't it by the dhikr of Allah that the heart is stilled? That this is what the heart wants. It wants to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when Allah is not remembered, when human beings forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what happens is the heart goes into a state of agitation. It goes into a state of turmoil, and it gets diseased because it's not being fed. Just like the cells need life-giving oxygen we need to breathe. If we stop breathing, cells die, and we die. The heart also needs to breathe, and the breath of the heart is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what feeds the heart. This is what nourishes the heart. The company of good people is the food of the heart. The exercise of the heart all of these things